I'm Harper Ellison, 29, sitting in my Aunt Diane's penthouse for the annual Ellison family meeting, a tradition soaked in power suits, portfolio updates, and casual cruelty. The floor-to-ceiling windows frame a breathtaking view of Manhattan's skyline, but all I feel is a tight knot in my chest as I swirl sparkling water in a crystal glass I didn't ask for. Everyone here smells like success, expensive colognes, designer fabrics, polished smiles. And me? I wore a navy blouse from a mid-range department store, tailored pants from a consignment shop, and flats I've had resold twice. My presence always sparks quiet side glances and louder assumptions. She's still finding herself, they'd say. Harper? Oh, she's got potential but no execution. The kind of backhanded sympathy that feels like a slap through a velvet glove. What they didn't know, what no one knew, was that I hadn't just found myself. I had built something. Quietly. Deliberately. And if they wanted to call me poor again, I was going to let them. Just once more. Because I was ready. The Ellisons are old money, with new ambitions. My grandfather built his fortune in post-war steel, and his children, my aunts and uncles, transformed it into a sprawling portfolio of biotech ventures, media properties, and high-end real estate. Family meetings were never about connection. They were about control. I was the only child of the black sheep, my father Alan, who'd walked away from the family fund to start a small architectural practice. He married my mother, an artist who painted murals in hospitals and public schools. Together, they built a life that prioritized substance over status. We lived in a brownstone in Brooklyn that had good bones and a soul. My father sketched buildings with integrity, not flash. My mother believed beauty should be accessible, not exclusive. They died when I was 17. A gas leak. I came home from school to flashing lights and neighbors whispering. And just like that, I became someone else's responsibility. Aunt Diane volunteered, or more accurately, claimed me. She was the oldest, the self-declared matriarch. Her Upper East Side apartment felt like a showroom, pristine, quiet, joyless. I moved in with one suitcase and a dozen books. She moved me into a guest room and a daily routine that involved etiquette tutors and trust fund discussions I never asked for. To her credit, she paid for my schooling. But every tuition check came with strings. Every holiday dinner was another evaluation. I didn't dress right, speak right, date right, and certainly not think right. So I did the one thing I could do quietly. I observed. At 19, I started working weekends at a local co-op bookstore in Brooklyn. Not because I needed the money, though I did, but because I craved something real. People came in looking for something meaningful, not just something marketable. It was the first place since my parents died that felt like home. I stayed with Aunt Diane through college and moved out the moment I graduated. My cousins celebrated with champagne and announcements about jobs in private equity. I took my small graduation check, sublet a one-bedroom in Queens, and started freelancing as a digital marketer. Nights were spent building websites for struggling nonprofits, managing social media accounts for authors, and slowly, strategically, investing in something no one else in my family respected: stories. See, while the Ellisons were busy acquiring things, I was acquiring rights, optioning books, web series, niche podcasts. I partnered with indie creators who had voices, but no visibility. I built a small media company, Woven House, that was essentially invisible to the glossy elite but was slowly becoming a powerhouse in the undercurrent of digital storytelling. No one in my family knew. Until the weekend, everything changed. It started, as it always did, with the invitation. The Ellison family meeting, held once a year in either Diane's Manhattan penthouse or my Uncle Colin's Napa estate. This year, it was Manhattan. A 3-day affair complete with formal dinners, quarterly updates, and legacy planning sessions designed to make sure no one ever rocked the boat. I almost didn't go, but something inside me stirred. Maybe it was time. Maybe I was done letting them talk about me like I was a detour in their legacy. So I said yes. I arrived on Friday afternoon in my modest but reliable Honda Civic, pulling into the building's underground parking lot between a matte black Range Rover and a Porsche Panamera. The valet gave me a raised eyebrow but took my keys without comment. In the elevator, I glanced at my reflection. Clean lines, minimal makeup, and a calm that had taken a decade to cultivate. The doors opened on the 32nd floor, and I was greeted by the quiet hum of wealth. Persian rugs, contemporary art, a view that screamed power. "Harper," Diane said, air-kissing both cheeks like we hadn't spoken only twice in the last year. "You look casual." "Good to see you too," I said, stepping inside. The rest of the family was already gathered in the main room. My cousin Sterling, predictably dressed like a walking GQ ad, was talking about a recent acquisition in Brazil. Celeste, his sister, chirped about her interior design firm's work on yachts. The cousins I'd once shared Legos with now dealt in venture rounds and designer dogs. And then came the comment. It wasn't dramatic. It wasn't even shouted. But it landed like a gavel. "I mean," Celeste said between sips of her spritzer, "we all know Harper's not really part of the financial engine of this family." She turned to me with faux sincerity. "No offense, sweetie, but you're kind of our philanthropic wildcard. The boho cousin." Sterling chuckled.
"Yeah."
"We call you our poor one when we're sorting allocations."
The room laughed.
Not loudly, just enough to let me know it wasn't the first time. I smiled.
Calmly.
Let the moment stretch until it was uncomfortable. "Interesting," I said, setting down my water, "because I've been wondering when I'd finally get to speak for myself." They blinked. A pause. Then the conversation shifted, awkwardly. But I'd already decided. This was the last time they'd call me poor and mean it. And by Monday, they would know exactly what I had done. Friday evening's dinner was as opulent as ever. Aunt Diane spared no expense on imported wines, a private chef, and candlelight centerpieces that looked straight out of a Vogue spread. Everyone was dressed like they were being photographed for a luxury magazine, and the conversation followed the same tired rhythm: startups, stock splits, ski homes, and socialite fundraisers. I kept my smile polite, my responses minimal, and my hands steady. "So, Harper," Uncle Colin drawled between bites of duck confit, "what are you working on these days?" "Still doing that artsy internet thing." He said artsy internet thing like it was a kind of skin rash. Something you'd whisper about in waiting rooms. "Woven House is expanding into serialized content," I replied evenly. "Short-form narrative production and a small podcast arm." Celeste smirked. "Podcasts? Like murder stuff or relationship advice?" "A bit of both," I said. "Plus investigative storytelling, niche cultural commentary, and licensed adaptations." Blank stares. Then a flicker of recognition from Sterling. "Wait, didn't Woven House option that viral story? What was it? The waitress who tricked her tech bro ex." I nodded. "That's us." "That show's on Hulu now, right?" he added, suddenly alert. "It's trending." Celeste looked annoyed. "You're involved with that?" "I produced it." I didn't elaborate further. Sterling's expression shifted, like something was clicking but not fully landing yet. The moment passed, replaced by another round of self-congratulation from my uncle about how his firm's new CFO was basically a wizard in Prada. I listened, not because I cared, but because I'd trained myself to listen like a hawk. People reveal things when they're trying to impress you. After dinner, I excused myself early under the guise of a work deadline. Truthfully, I needed the quiet. I stepped out onto the penthouse balcony, staring at the city that had raised and tested me. I remembered riding the subway home with sore feet and $8 in my bank account. I remembered eating dollar pizza slices between freelance gigs and tracking download metrics with obsessive precision. And I remembered every single time someone in this family had laughed at me behind champagne flutes. What they never saw was that behind every small project was a carefully chosen IP. Behind every collaboration was a strategy. Woven House didn't chase fame. We built catalogs. I wasn't gambling on trends. I was investing in human attention, in cultural stickiness, in modern folklore. And I was ready to prove it. Saturday morning's agenda was Family Business Forecasts, an intentionally intimidating title for what was really just a brag parade. We met in Diane's conference room, where a hired assistant handed out personalized binders embossed with the Ellison crest. "I figured you wouldn't need one," Diane said lightly as I sat down. Unless you want to observe. I brought my own materials, I said, placing my leather portfolio on the table. She blinked, not expecting that. The meeting began with Sterling walking us through his new hedge fund's performance. He used slides, bar graphs, and an annoying amount of real-time market jargon. His voice grew animated every time he mentioned early-stage AI platforms or next-gen predictive analytics. Next came Celeste with a sleek presentation about her expansion into boutique luxury experiential staging, a convoluted way to say she decorates spaces for rich people who want their homes to look like curated Instagram feeds. Then came the usual updates from cousins involved in fashion lines, tech startups, or disruptive wellness apps that all looked like rebranded kombucha. When it was my turn, no one looked up. A few checked their phones. Diane didn't even pause her sip of espresso. I'll keep this simple, I began. Woven House currently manages 11 option properties. 5 are in active development with streaming platforms, and 2 are being packaged for film. Our average licensing deal nets 6 figures. We just signed a partnership with a global distributor to localize content in 4 languages. And this quarter, we crossed $9.2 million in gross revenue. Silence. Slowly, Sterling sat forward. You're kidding.
No.
Celeste frowned. But you don't have an office. Or staff. We work remotely. Agile production teams. Minimal overhead. Strategic IP acquisition. Think small studio meets boutique publishing house. Uncle Colin narrowed his eyes. Wait, are you saying Woven House owns the rights to those stories? Not just produces them. I nodded. We secure literary, podcast, and life rights before they go viral. Then we develop in-house or license them out. It's IP farming. They all stared at me like I'd spoken in tongues. It's an unregulated pipeline, Sterling muttered, clearly recalculating. You're upstream from most content houses.
Correct, I said.
We don't chase trends. We build them. Diane leaned back, her expression unreadable. And how much of this is actually yours? All of it. Your sole owner? Founder.
CEO.
And yes, I own 100% equity. A pause. Then Sterling let out a short laugh, not mocking, but incredulous. Jesus, Harper. I kept my voice calm, measured. I didn't want a seat at the Ellison table just to play along. I built my own. And now people are paying to sit with me. No one spoke. The assistant at the end of the room coughed into her sleeve. I didn't gloat. I didn't raise my voice. But I let the moment settle like dust on polished glass. It was the kind of silence that filled a vacuum when illusions finally cracked. After the meeting, I found myself in the hallway with Celeste. So, she said carefully, brushing imaginary lint from her designer blazer, what you said in there was impressive. Thanks. She glanced sideways. Do you have any open projects? Ones that might need visual direction? It wasn't friendship. It was opportunism. But it was a start. I'll let you know, I said. Back in my guest room, I pulled out the contract I'd been reviewing all week, an offer from a major platform to buy majority equity in Woven House. 8 figures.
Clean.
No creative control lost. I hadn't signed it yet. I was still deciding. But that night, I knew one thing with certainty. By the end of this weekend, no one in the Ellison family would ever again mistake modesty for failure. They'd called me poor for the last time. Sunday's itinerary was the part of the Ellison family meeting I had always loathed the most, the philanthropic and legacy planning session. It was less about doing good and more about being seen doing good. Everyone had a foundation. Everyone had a cause. But most were little more than PR vehicles dressed up in moral language. Uncle Colin went first, beaming as he discussed his wildlife preservation trust, which mostly involved sponsoring polo tournaments and leasing private land in Kenya. Celeste spoke next, presenting her new Art in Underserved Communities initiative. It sounded noble until you realized most of the underserved communities were gentrified neighborhoods hosting art pop-ups that just happened to coincide with her property investments. Then it was Sterling's turn. He stood confidently, detailing his think tank for digital ethics, which had been cited in Forbes but was primarily staffed by interns from Ivy Leagues and funded by companies with questionable data policies. Diane, of course, had the piece de resistance: the Ellison Institute for Female Empowerment, headquartered in a Manhattan building that bore her name in letters taller than my first apartment ceilings. "Harper, dear," Diane said as the spotlight rotated toward me. "Have you found a cause yet? Something to pour your heart into?" I looked around the room, every face watching, expecting me to either fumble through some vague answer or shrug it off entirely. "I've been funding media literacy programs in public high schools," I said calmly. "We started with 3 schools in Queens. We're up to 9 now. I've also partnered with a re-entry initiative to train former inmates in audio production. Our first graduate just got hired at a podcasting network." Sterling blinked. "Wait, seriously?" "Yes." I didn't embellish.
Just the facts.
"And the funding?" Uncle Colin asked skeptically. "That kind of thing requires infrastructure." "Self-funded," I replied. Woven House allocates 18% of its profits to a social impact wing I founded last year. We're small, but deliberate. Diane's lips thinned. Not in disapproval exactly, more like irritation that her long-held assumptions didn't fit anymore. After the session, as people filtered out for brunch, I stayed behind in the conference room, gathering my papers. Jessica, my only cousin who'd ever treated me like more than a curiosity, slid into the seat beside me. "That was something," she said, tucking her hair behind her ear. "You've changed, Harp." "I didn't change," I said softly. "I just stopped hiding." Jessica studied me. "They're spinning, trying to figure out how they missed it. How you went from the family charity case to someone who could probably buy half of them out." "I'm not interested in buyouts." "No," she said, smiling slightly. "You're interested in impact. Always have been." We talked quietly for a while, about family, about values, about the way wealth can bend people without them even realizing it. Then, just before we left the room, she paused. "They're going to test you now. Push to see if this was a one-time reveal, or if you're really ready to stand on equal footing." "I'm ready," I said. "More than they are." Monday morning arrived with clouded skies and a tension that vibrated through the penthouse like static. Today's schedule? Structural realignment and voting. The term realignment was code for something bigger: the redistribution of power within the family trust. I knew what was coming. Diane and Colin had been lobbying for years to shift more voting control toward themselves and their descendants. They called it streamlining. I called it what it was: consolidation. As we took our seats in the main hall, a thick binder was placed in front of each of us. Inside, proposed amendments to the family charter. Diane stood at the head of the table, flanked by 2 family attorneys. "We've all seen how much the world has changed," she began, in the same diplomatic tone she used at fundraising galas. "To preserve the strength of the Ellison legacy, we need leadership that reflects clarity, experience, and, most importantly, contribution." Several heads nodded automatically. Mine did not. "These amendments," she continued, "will restructure the voting weights. Going forward, votes will be awarded based on verified financial contribution to the Ellison Trust. Higher capital input, higher voting power. This incentivizes meaningful participation." It was cleverly worded, but I saw the trap. Anyone not actively feeding the trust with investments would lose power. And conveniently, Diane and Colin's portfolios were the largest contributors, on paper at least. "Before we vote," I said, standing slowly, "I'd like to request the floor." Diane arched an eyebrow but gestured toward the front of the room.
Briefly.
I walked up, leather portfolio in hand, and placed a single document on the table before the attorneys. "This," I said, projecting my voice clearly, "is an offer from Apex Holdings to acquire a 40% stake in Woven House for $42 million. I have not accepted it." Murmurs rippled across the room. "Instead," I continued, "I've transferred Woven House into a new holding company, Ellison Parallel Ventures, a private entity I formed last week. It's wholly owned by me. Today, I am offering EPV as a strategic investor into the Ellison Trust with a $15 million contribution." Effective immediately. Silence. Jessica's eyes widened. Celeste looked like she'd swallowed a lemon. That would place Harper, the junior attorney said slowly, scanning the trust's rules, in the top 3 voting blocks, ahead of Celeste and even Sterling. Uncle Colin muttered something under his breath. Diane remained composed, but I saw it in her eyes. The calculation.
The shift.
I have no intention of becoming a puppet, I added. But I do intend to be part of this conversation. Permanently. Not as a guest. Not as a sympathy vote. As a stakeholder. There was nothing left to say. The vote passed, but not with the margin Diane wanted. She'd lost control. And she knew it. Later that evening, she cornered me by the wine bar as most of the family sipped cocktails and quietly reevaluated their internal power maps. "You planned this," she said, not accusingly, just stating fact. "I prepared," I corrected. "You planned to erase me from the table. I just declined to let that happen. You've always had potential. But there's a way things are done in this family. Maybe it's time we redefine that," I replied. "Legacy isn't about control. It's about what we leave standing after we're gone." She didn't argue. She just looked at me for a long, long moment, then gave the slightest of nods. I walked away before she could turn it into a truce. I wasn't here for symbolic peace. I was here because I had earned my place by building something real. They had called me poor at the beginning of the weekend. Now, they had to call me something else. Necessary. Tuesday morning came quiet and cold, a veil of fog rolling over the skyline as I sat alone in the guest room with a cup of black coffee. The suite still smelled faintly of whatever luxury detergent Diane preferred, something floral and aloof. I hadn't slept much, but I didn't need sleep. I felt sharp, settled, finally unburdened by the weight of pretending. Last night's vote had changed the family dynamic in ways no one could reverse. The room had fallen into a stunned hush when I delivered my investment announcement, my intentional power move. $15 million into the family trust wasn't just an economic shift. It was a symbolic one. I had entered their carefully guarded inner circle not through inheritance or marriage or name, but through merit. At breakfast, people were quiet around me. Not hostile, just uncertain, as if I were a new species they hadn't yet learned how to label. Sterling was the first to break the silence. "You really blindsided us," he said, slipping into the seat across from me with a croissant he didn't touch. "You mean you underestimated me," I corrected, stirring a spoon of honey into my coffee.
He didn't argue.
Just leaned back in his chair, studying me. "You always seemed so distant. Quiet." I was busy building while everyone else was performing. A slow smirk tugged at his lips.
Fair.
"But you understand what happens now, right? They're going to start circling. You've got attention. Real leverage. I didn't ask for it. Doesn't matter. You have it. And power never comes without cost." He paused, then added more quietly, "You ready for that?" I took a long sip of coffee before answering. "I've paid the cost already. You just didn't see it." He nodded once and stood, slipping back into his curated world of tailored banter and silver spoons. Jessica appeared a few minutes later with her usual grace, holding a folder and a hopeful expression. She slid it toward me without a word. Inside were plans for a new family-funded initiative, a network of digital learning centers in underserved communities, partnering with libraries and schools to provide media training, financial literacy, and basic coding. "I've been sitting on this for a year," she said. "No one took it seriously. Thought maybe now you'd look." I scanned the proposal quickly, impressed. Thoughtful, scalable, and rooted in the kind of impact Diane and Colin would never understand. "You wrote this?" She nodded. "I don't just sit on boards and sip lattes, you know." "I do now." We exchanged a smile. Something real. A thread we'd woven over years of mutual side-eyes and whispered truths behind linen napkins. By noon, Diane had announced a revised agenda for the final day of meetings. "Given Harper's recent contribution," she said during the closing session, "we'll be amending the leadership planning section to include a strategic discussion with all current voting members. That now includes Harper Ellison." The murmurs were polite, but stunned. Everyone still adjusting to the fact that I was now a major player. The conference room was rearranged into a tighter circle. No stage. No podium. Just chairs, equal in height, equal in placement. It was symbolic, but I appreciated the effort. Diane began with her usual polished grace. We've spent the past 3 days reflecting on our legacy, on how we present ourselves to the world, on what the Ellison name means not just to us, but to those outside this room. She turned toward me. Harper, since you've changed the landscape of our holdings quite literally overnight, would you be willing to share your perspective? What do you think the Ellison name should mean? Everyone watched, waiting, expecting something grand or scathing. I gave them neither. It should mean something more than wealth, I began. We've proven we know how to build portfolios. But legacy isn't just measured in dividends and trust fund distributions. It's measured in what we protect, what we elevate, what we leave behind. I stood, not out of drama, but out of conviction. For years, I stayed quiet while you laughed at my choices. You assumed I was poor because I didn't play the same game. But wealth isn't about optics. It's about autonomy. I used mine to build something with meaning, to give voice to people who aren't heard in rooms like this. I turned to Diane. You asked me once what I was doing with my life. You asked again this weekend. The answer is simple. I'm doing exactly what I was meant to do. And now I intend to use my seat at this table to make sure we're not just building monuments to ourselves. The room was still, silent in a way that meant they were listening, not just hearing. Diane nodded slowly. For once, no comeback. No spin. Uncle Colin clapped once, then twice more. The rest followed. Later, when the meeting adjourned and people began packing up their monogrammed portfolios, Celeste approached me with a carefully curated smile. So, she began, about that media strategy you mentioned. Think you'd ever consult? On what? I asked, amused. My personal brand, she said, as if that were the most natural phrase in the world. I'll think about it, I replied. But my rates are higher than the family discount. She laughed, but her eyes narrowed slightly. She knew I wasn't joking. In the hallway, Sterling caught up to me again. Hey, he said, surprisingly sincere. You made your point. Loud and clear. I wasn't trying to make a point, I said. Just claiming my space. Well, he offered his hand. Welcome to the family, officially. I took it. That evening, I returned to Queens. To my one-bedroom apartment with mismatched plates and a bookshelf stuffed with stories I'd optioned before anyone else had believed in them. I didn't upgrade.
Didn't pour a celebratory drink.
I just ordered takeout, changed into sweatpants, and opened my laptop. Because the work didn't stop here. The family may have finally seen me, but I'd always seen myself. And that was what mattered most. They had called me poor with smirks and sideways comments. Now they knew better. Now I had not just a seat at the table. I had the table.
And I was choosing who got to sit with me.
6 months later, the landscape had shifted. Not just for me, but for the entire Ellison family. It didn't happen overnight, and it certainly didn't happen without resistance. But the tone had changed. I'd gone from an afterthought to a variable no one could ignore, because I didn't just reveal my power. I used it. I started with what mattered most to me. Substance, not symbolism. Woven House had expanded, quietly, strategically. We signed 2 more multi-year deals with major streaming platforms. I brought on a few key staff members I trusted, people who understood the value of stories told by underrepresented voices. We weren't flashy. We didn't issue press releases or host rooftop parties. But the work was growing, and the audience with it. I never moved out of my apartment. Not because I couldn't afford it. At this point, I could have bought the entire building, but because it still felt right. My Honda was replaced only because the old one died, and even then I chose a modest hybrid. Some people thought that meant I hadn't changed. But the truth was, I'd only become more of who I'd always been. Every month, I received updates from Jessica. Her digital learning center proposal had been greenlit. We co-funded the pilot. The first facility opened in the Bronx and offered weekend programs in digital storytelling, podcast production, and financial basics for teens. Every time we visited, we walked past students hunched over microphones or storyboards, creating worlds of their own. And every time, I thought of my parents, of their quiet creativity, of the way they loved with their hands, through sketches and colors and weekend projects that had never made headlines, but had filled our home with meaning. One day in spring, I returned to the penthouse, not as a guest or a curiosity, but as the featured speaker for the Ellison Legacy Forum, a newly minted annual event that Diane insisted on organizing now that the next generation had a more visible presence. I stood in front of 60 people, mostly family, some extended partners and board members, all seated around polished marble and catered pastries. I wore a black jumpsuit and no jewelry except the simple gold ring my mother had worn every day of her life. "My name is Harper Ellison," I began, "and for years I let you decide who I was. Quiet,
Soft. Poor.
but I wasn't any of those things. I was building. And now, I'm here to remind you that wealth isn't a mirror. It's a window, a chance to see something beyond ourselves. To build something that lasts longer than our own egos." Some of them nodded. Some just blinked. That was fine. I wasn't speaking for their applause. I was speaking for anyone in the room who had ever felt underestimated. Anyone who'd had to bite their tongue while others told a version of their story that wasn't true. Afterward, Aunt Diane pulled me aside. "You've become something I didn't expect," she admitted. Her voice lacked the usual polish. This wasn't performance. This was honest. "I became who I always was," I replied. She looked at me for a long moment. "You remind me of your father. He was never interested in the spotlight either. He taught me that some lights blind more than they illuminate." That made her smile. For once, not in that tight, society-mannered way, but something soft, something real. "I think he'd be proud," she said, then added, "I know your grandmother would." Later that night, I walked home instead of catching a car. The spring air was crisp, and the city pulsed with life. I passed a newsstand with a magazine that had, for the first time ever, listed Woven House as one of the top indie content firms in New York. My face wasn't on the cover. It never would be. That was by design. But I smiled anyway, not for the recognition, but for the full circle moment. At home, I made tea and opened a message from a young writer we'd discovered through a college podcast. She'd sent a pilot script, rough, imperfect, but so full of soul I couldn't stop reading. I sent her an offer the next morning. Weeks later, at a coffee shop downtown, she asked, "Why did you pick me?" I told her the truth. "Because your story reminded me of mine, and I know what it feels like to be overlooked." She blinked back tears. "No one's ever said that to me."
Get used to it, I said, smiling.
"Because now they'll have to see you." And that, I realized, was the legacy I wanted. Not empire, not accolades, but impact. A ripple effect. One that started when I chose not to prove myself with volume, but with value. When I finally told the truth, not just to my family, but to myself. That moment back in Diane's penthouse, the one where they called me poor, used to sting. For years, I replayed it. The laughter,
The smugness.
the dismissal.
But now?
Now, it plays like a prelude. The moment before the shift. Before the reveal. Before I reclaimed my narrative. And I wouldn't erase it for anything. Because that's when I stopped waiting to be accepted and started claiming my own space. So if someone out there calls you less than, not enough, or poor, let them. Let them speak first. Then build something so undeniable, their words start to sound like the setup to your favorite plot twist. They called me poor. So I moved out and built something they couldn't afford to ignore. And that's just the beginning.